everyone. Welcome to Dirt Nap City, the show about interesting dead people. And I'm here today sitting in blazing hot Austin, Texas, where I think it's supposed to hit like 105 today. Alex, what's the temperature in your world?
I think it's about 102 with maybe a heat index of 111. It's toasty.
Now, Alex, it's summertime. You and I recently took a trip to Cleveland, right?
Yeah, that was beautiful weather there.
Well, I'm going to give you your first hint about this person. This person was actually very much associated with Cleveland and sort of made his name in Cleveland in business. He was born in 1839 in upstate New York, died in Florida in 1937, but became famous through his work in Cleveland. Any thoughts on that right out of the gate? Cleveland, are you ready to rock?
Wow, no, I need more hints.
Originally, while he was in Cleveland, he was his very first job actually was as a bookkeeper. He bookkept for a small firm, and he eventually started selling wholesale groceries. But then there was oil discovered in Pennsylvania and Ohio, western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and he kind of hopped on the oil wagon early on and sort of built his reputation and his business on oil.
Okay.
He was the world's first billionaire.
Okay.
He was sort of vilified by a lot of people and had some very unflattering articles written about him. But he also was a very giving man and ended up really changing the world through his charitable giving later in life.
Yeah, I think I know the family. It's like a family of rich people, right?
Yeah. But we're talking about the OG in this family.
Yeah, people used to. The name is escaping me. Who do you think I am?
Well, I'll tell you who it's not. It's not Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt.
No, it's not Vanderbilt.
It's not Henry Ford. These are some of his peers. It's not J.P. Morgan. It's not Andrew Carnegie or Carnegie.
Yeah, those are some of the names that were floating through my head. But there's another one. It's just on the tip of my tongue. Like, who do you think we are? As soon as you say the name, it's gonna bug me.
Well, let's just say if you spilled something in the basement, you might have to mop a cellar.
Rockefeller. Who do you think we are? The Rockefellers? Yeah. John D Rockefeller.
Rockefeller. Yes, we're going to talk about him. Did you know he was the world's first billionaire?
It makes sense. I didn't know the Cleveland connection.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, we actually walked down Euclid Avenue, or we rode scooters down Euclid Avenue, and he lived on Euclid Avenue on that same road where that fancy grocery store was that we went to.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Really? No, I didn't know that.
We went past a building as we were getting back to the bridge to go over to that river. What was the name of that river? The
Cuyahoga River.
Yeah. There's a Rockefeller building right there on the edge of the Cuyahoga. And the Cuyahoga, incidentally, used to catch fire because of the oil refineries down there. Well, guess who owned the oil refineries?
Rockefeller.
He was certainly one of the people responsible for that. Then, the reason, I don't know if we talked about this, but the reason that the river would catch fire is because gasoline, or a non-pure version of gasoline, was a byproduct when they refined oil for kerosene, and they would just pour it into the river. And so there got to be so much of it that, if somebody was using a steamship with coal, threw a hot coal over the side, boom, it would go up.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jay-Z's record company, his first record company was called Rockefeller.
He was born in upstate New York, as I said, in 1839, July 8th. Very, very modest family, but his family was actually, interestingly, his mother, Eliza Davidson, was an extremely religious, very pious, very kind of waste not, want not kind of person. Was married to a man named Devil Bill, is what they called him. He was a very, very well. He was a con artist. His name
Did
was
you say
William
Devil Bill?
Devil Bill. Yeah, he had a reputation as being a con artist, and he sold botanical elixirs that were supposed to cure cancer and do all kinds of things like that. Like he basically went around selling these things and bilking people out of money because they didn't actually do what they were supposed to do.
Snake oil salesman.
Exactly. That was Devil Bill. And it really kind of was an interesting situation because John D was very much a pleaser. He was very much a religious kid because he was taught to, as a matter of fact, he stated, this was a quote from him, he said, "From the beginning, I was trained to work, to save, and to give." But then his father was quoted as saying, "I cheated my boys every chance I got to make them sharp." And so he not only was Devil Bill a snake oil salesman, but he also was bigamist. He was married to a woman in Canada, and he spent much of the time with his Canadian family. He and in addition to in addition to being married to a second wife in Canada, he also had a mistress that lived with the family in Canada. So his maid, a woman who cleaned his house named Nancy Brown, was the mother of several of his children, of Devil Bill's children.
I feel
But
like that would definitely shape your upbringing. But now,
yes,
did he name himself Devil? Like, was that a term that he came up with, or that what his enemies called him?
no, that's really what the community called him because he was known. He was known as that. He was also known as Big Bill. He was a very tall man. He lived to be 96, I believe, so he had a long, long life. But he called himself Dr. Levingston. In his bigamist marriage to the Canadian woman, he was actually known as Dr. William Levingston. So he had pseudonyms. He traveled around the country selling these snake oil and went back and forth between Cleveland and Canada to visit his two different families and kind of kept them separated. Like they didn't know about each other until much later in his life.
I've
So
always been fascinated with people with double lives. It seems like so much work. If you lead a double life, you should email us.
it takes a fast car lady to lead a double life.
You you really need to email us, and we won't tell anybody. I promise. Just tell us a little bit of what it's like.
Maybe we could have you on as a guest.
But we'll have to garble your voice and
Yeah.
all that. But I think double lives are fascinating.
So basically, it's like you said, it really shaped his upbringing. He had this very religious, very pious mother, good-hearted woman, Eliza, and a very fast-talking sort of snake oil father who was absent most of the time. As they got older, the kids, the family, he had two brothers and a sister. They moved to Cleveland. And when he was 16 years old, he got a job as a bookkeeper for a produce company called Hewitt and Tuttle. Isn't that a very 19 or 1800s, 19th century name, Hewitt and Tuttle?
Yeah, but it's better than what we have now with just nonsensical words like
True.
Google and Yahoo
And words that are misspelled on purpose, like flicker. He ended up working for them for a couple of years and realized he was kind of a protege with numbers and decided that he could do it better. He started his own wholesale food grocery business trading in Cleveland and started off with that. And then the opportunity to be involved in the wholesale buying and selling of oil came to be. He got involved in oil, but at that time, he realized because oil was real hit or miss whether or not you were going to hit it. Now, one of the biggest oil fields that was first discovered, you know where it was? I mean, I said it earlier.
Oh, you did say it earlier?
Western Pennsylvania, earlier,
Right,
Eastern
right.
Ohio.
This is the comprehension section of the
It wasn't Texas, it wasn't California, it wasn't the Middle East. The first place to really find oil was a place in Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio, and these derricks, oil derricks, drillers started popping up everywhere. Drilling companies forming all over. It was a mad rush, and during that time, and this was in the 1870s, 1860s, 1870s, during that time, people were starting to worry a little bit about whether or not that field was going to stay, whether they were going to be able to eventually pull all the oil out. Now, at first, they used oil for things like they actually put crude oil on to cuts and used it as a medical balm. It was put on to people to help them with things like that. But eventually, the killer app for it was kerosene. So once they figured out how to refine and make kerosene, before that, if you think about this, in the early 1800s, early to mid 1800s, when the sun went down, it just got dark. There was no flashlights. There was no electricity. There were no gas lamps. There were no kerosene lamps. You could build a fire, but that was all you could do with logs and timber or coal or something like that.
You think people went to bed at like 6 o'clock
Absolutely.
in the wintertime?
Absolutely, they did. Yes. That was much more, bed with to bed when the sun goes down and rise when the sun comes up, a lot more back then. So they realized that kerosene was going to be a huge thing. And that's when Rockefeller, rather than getting into drilling, decided to get into refining. And he realized that refining was, drillers could hit or miss, but they all still had to have their product refined in order to sell it. So that was the birth of, do you know the name of the company he founded that was pretty famous?
Was it Sohio?
No, Standard Oil.
Standard Oil.
Standard Oil Company was his company that he founded, and it became a behemoth of a company. I mean, it just over time, it was a behemoth. Part of the reason was because Rockefeller was initially successful. He was one of the first people to set up a refinery that could actually increase the safety and the quality of the kerosene. And the name was a double meaning. It was supposed to standardize kerosene, but also become the industry standard. So he meant it as a double meaning, kind of inadvertently good marketing that he did with that. So when he was first starting out, Standard Oil was kind of struggling. They were making kerosene. They were, shipping maybe 30 barrels a day or 40 barrels a day or something like that. Not a whole lot, but he had the opportunity to meet with Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt was actually initially big in the train and railroad and transportation, shipping in general. Like he shipped stuff from place to place. And they called him the Commodore because he was a shipper. Vanderbilt invited John D Rockefeller to come to New York City from Cleveland and meet with him about an agreement to ship his product, his kerosene, in Vanderbilt's trains, right? So, ironically, John D Rockefeller was going to take a train from Cleveland and get a connection in Buffalo, and then from Buffalo, he was going to take the train to New York City. Well, he left his home a little too late, missed the train from Cleveland's Union Station to Buffalo, and guess what happened? The train derailed that he was supposed to be on and killed almost everyone on it. About 50 people died. It was called the Horror, one of the biggest train accidents in the 19th century, 1800s. This was in 1867. And if John had been on that train, he would have most likely died.
Wow.
But he missed the train. And John always had this thing that he believed, because he was a very religious person, he believed that he was destined to make money and that he was destined to help the world with that money. And after that accident, he actually said, I do regard the thing as the providence of God. And what he meant by that was that he missed the train for a reason. God had instructed him to miss that train or made him miss that train so he could fulfill his destiny.
Yeah, I've met people in situations like that where they've escaped death or they've had something happen where they were spared. And there is something that happens to you, I believe, where you have this different perspective on life where you thought, well, either I'm destined for greatness, or if that didn't touch me, nothing will. And you kind of have that. But have you ever met anybody that's had that kind of experience where they kind of just had a near miss?
I don't know if you're teeing me up or if I've ever told you this, or maybe I've told you and you forgot. I was supposed to be in the World Trade Center on September 11th.
I don't think I know this.
So I worked for a software company and we were doing a product launch, and the product launch was kind of a whole thing where in the morning there were press briefings, and then in the afternoon and evening there was like a launch, where they would actually demo the product, and then a reception in Times Square that night. And the press briefing was supposed to be at Windows on the World, and I was the multimedia guy. I had produced a bunch of videos that were going to play at the press briefing, and I was in charge of making them all play. And it got changed at the last minute to a different venue.
Wow. That's amazing. I never knew that.
I was in New York on September 11th, and so I always kind of considered that my close call.
So did you kind of have that change or perspective? Did things change for you, at least in the short term?
I think for me it was not just the fact that I would have been up there had and most likely died had we had that press briefing and it hadn't changed. It was just being in New York when that happened was a very surreal experience, and very much made me super kind of reflective, and reevaluate what am I doing with my life. If I died tomorrow, would I feel like I had fulfilled what I wanted to fulfill? Would I be the kind of person that people would remember in a good way? All that sort of thing. So I think it did in a maybe short term, but I've never felt like I was on the wrong path or anything like that. So it wasn't like I felt like I had to make major course corrections after that, but it definitely emotionally and sort of spiritually impacted me. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could see how it might have affected Rockefeller too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So he ends up later going to New York to meet with Vanderbilt, and he and Vanderbilt strike up a deal where he's going to provide the oil to ship on Vanderbilt's trains, and Vanderbilt is going to give him a discount. So he's promising to ship a certain amount. Well, he overpromised more than he was actually making at the time. So that was a little bit of a problem, but he goes back to Cleveland, ramps up production, ends up getting the deal with Vanderbilt, eventually and very quickly outgrows it. This is when everybody's getting kerosene lamps. And guess what they would do? They actually had people originally that would deliver kerosene in horse-drawn carriages, either in barrels or in big tankers that they would fill up at people's houses. And they would give people free kerosene lamps, kerosene lanterns. But guess what you had to buy? You had to buy the kerosene.
Yeah.
It's just like the razor companies, right?
Sure. And the first cell phone companies were like that too. The phone was free. You had to pay for the minutes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So they he ended up outgrowing Vanderbilt and met a guy named Tom Scott, who was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's really interesting too, because in listening to all these railroad names, they were all straight out of the game Monopoly, like the Reading Railroad and the Pennsylvania.
B&O.
Yeah, the B&O, B&H. B&H is a camera store. B&O. Anyway, he in 1871. So he had originally made this deal with Vanderbilt in 1867. In 1871, he meets this guy named Tom Scott, who, by the way, is the boss of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie works for Tom Scott, and Andrew Carnegie's still up and coming at this time, as is Rockefeller. They meet and they form this company or group. It's kind of a secret group called the South Improvement Company, and it was basically an alliance between Tom Scott's railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Standard Oil. And the way it worked is the Pennsylvania Railroad agreed to raise their prices across the board, but then give discounts to Standard Oil. And so what this effectively did was, if you were transporting your oil or your kerosene by train and you weren't Standard Oil, you had to pay much higher shipping costs or transportation costs, and it drove a lot of other refineries and producers out of business. Essentially, one of the first things that he did that was monopolistic in his career, this South Improvement Company. This was eventually caught onto by a few people, and he actually had to go speak in front of Congress, and there was a whole thing about it where he got into trouble. He was never remorseful about it. He always felt like he was just making deals and doing business. And at the time, there wasn't really anything around antitrust or anti-monopoly laws. This was all new territory. Like, no companies had grown this big. Well, because of what he did, because the South Improvement Company had gone so well, a lot of companies ended up having to shut down. Guess what Rockefeller did? He went and bought them all out really cheap. Some of the ones he bought out, he paid and kept running. Some of the ones he bought out, he paid and shut down just so they wouldn't be there anymore. And this was called the Cleveland Massacre. So he actually got this reputation for being really ruthless by creating this false competition by teaming up with Tom Scott at the railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, and then by driving his competitors out of business because he had so much less shipping costs that he was able to run his business much more effectively.
Now, you had said that he thought his mission was to make a lot of money and help people around the world. Did he start doing this philanthropy early, or was that always just another 100? If I make another 100 million, then I'll start doing that.
No, actually, interestingly, he did start doing philanthropy early. He was very involved in the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in Cleveland. He became involved in his church also in New York City, and was a financial sponsor of those churches. And he was also known to give money to Baptist congregations when he would travel. And he was very much an abolitionist, on the side of the North from the Civil War, and was known to donate a lot to African American, the recently freed slaves. He actually gave money to a lot of their churches. And even early in his days, he believed in basically what I think a lot of people who are, church-going people of faith, there's tithing. And I think, sometimes it's said it's 10%, but he believed in 1/3 should be saved, 1/3 should be spent, and 1/3 should be donated to everything. And he instilled that in his own children. As a matter of fact, he made his own children keep a account book of the money that they made and what they spent it on. And every week he would have them come and he would reward them with a nickel if they kept a good, clean account book, and he would penalize them of a nickel if they couldn't account for all their money. So I guess in answer to your question, he became much more of a philanthropist a little bit later in life, like maybe around his 40s or 50s. But early on, he was always very much, at least from the sources that I saw. And by the way, this was a book called Titan that I read. Let me get the author's name real quick. Ron Chernow was the book's author, and the book's called Titan. And, he was one of these guys, Rockefeller, first of all, wealthiest man in the world during that time period, first billionaire in the world. But he was a big target because so many saw him as ruthless and monopolistic and, again, driving other people out of business. Now, have you ever heard of Ida Tarbell?
Ida Tarbell?
Yeah, Ida Tarbell. She was a young woman during the time when, and not by young, I mean, she was a child, like teenager, during the time when the Cleveland Massacre happened. And her family was actually directly impacted. I think she belonged to a family that had, that was doing drilling, was doing, acquisition of oil. And her family got run out of business. She ended up being a writer for a popular magazine called McClure's. And in 1903, she started a series about Rockefeller that really tarnished him. It was very popular. A lot of people loved to hate him. They thought that he was, what was wrong with the rich in the country at that time. And if you'll remember back then, part of the reason he became the world's first billionaire and why it's so hard to replicate the amount of wealth he had today. I mean, there's some people that are close, but in today's dollars, he was just extravagantly wealthy. It's because we didn't really have a tax system. We didn't have inheritance taxes. We didn't have income taxes the way we do now. These things all started to come to be, especially under, guess who? Our old friend, Teddy Roosevelt, in the early 1900s. So anyway, Ida Tarbell wrote a very, very damaging to his reputation series about, and popular series about Standard Oil and their executives. And one of the biggest mistakes that John D Rockefeller made, he never said anything. He was a very pious man. He, as a matter of fact, you were asking about his donations. He never actually liked to get acknowledgement. He never came out and told people when he donated something. He wanted the recipient to tell people. Like, he didn't like to brag about it himself. He wanted it to be heard from the recipient, that, hey, Mr. Rockefeller donated to our church, or Mr. Rockefeller donated to this cause. So he was very much a man who gave a lot because of his religious beliefs and the belief that God wanted him to do it. But he didn't always talk about it. Well, he was also very quiet and didn't really dispute any of the things that Ida Tarbell said about him. So she just kind of had a field day with accusations and with all the things he had done wrong and all the businesses he had ruined and all of that sort of thing, and kind of worked the country into an anti-Rockefeller fervor. But you probably don't think of the Rockefellers that way, do you?
No.
What do you think of when you think of the name Rockefeller?
I just think of the original rich, like the original rich people in America.
You think of their impact today. What are some things that you know about?
Yeah, probably what you were saying about monopolies. I think of monopolies when I think of them. And then of course isn't his grandson the vice president of the United States?
Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York and vice president under Henry Ford. You're correct.
Yeah. But I just think of like rich oil executives, like you said, kind of pre-antitrust, just kind of making their own rules, doing whatever they want. I think of ruthless business. I don't think of the philanthropy stuff, although there's tons of things still named after Rockefeller. So I imagine
that's what I was getting at. That's actually what I was getting at, was all the things that were named after him. There are so many other things that he didn't name after himself that he was a part of, that he contributed to, but didn't want his name on it. He wasn't about self-congratulations on the things that he donated over the years. So what happened is the country kind of got negative on the Rockefellers. And then in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt had what he called the Trust Busters. And there were antitrust suits brought up against a number of companies, the railroads, the steel industry, the oil industry, all these monopolies that were coming in. And he sort of made an example out of Standard Oil. He very much thought Standard Oil was the biggest and the worst and the most egregious. And so Teddy Roosevelt decided to make an example out of them. For over 10 years, this was in the courts. And finally, in 1911, the Supreme Court found Standard Oil to be in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. I mean, you've probably heard that term, Sherman Antitrust Act. They were found in violation. They basically, the biggest thing they did was they created these other companies, and they didn't even acknowledge that they were owned by Standard Oil. So these were companies that were supposed to look like competitors, but in reality, the Rockefellers and his group were pulling the strings. So that was the thing that kind of was their undoing. But here's the really ironic part, is that after the Supreme Court handed down this antitrust legislation or verdict, they had them break apart Standard Oil into 34 different companies. Well, ironically, what happened is those companies all became almost as successful as the original company had been and grew. It was like throwing spores off of a flower or a tree, and they all became big trees too. And so that was really, he went from being insanely wealthy to being just unimaginably wealthy. Because let me just give you some of the names of the companies that that they became. So they had Standard Oil of New Jersey, that became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Standard Oil of California, Chevron. Atlantic Refining became Arco, which later became Sun. Continental Oil became Conoco, and then ConocoPhillips. And then Standard Oil of Ohio was actually absorbed by British Petroleum to great profit of the owners of Standard Oil of Ohio. So
That's amazing. So like every major oil company today has its lineage back to Rockefeller.
except for Royal Dutch Shell. So Shell was the only one that was a competitor that survived, and and again, it wasn't based in the U.S. was part of the reason. So yeah, he really did have a monopoly at a time when that was a new thing, and he saw it kind of an ends justifying the means kind of thing. So he had, real quick, I'll say he had a brother. He had two brothers and a sister, and his one brother, Will, worked for Standard Oil. Didn't have quite the money that he had, but was still amazingly rich. And then he had a brother named Frank, who he was always at odds with, and he and Frank like never really got along. And as a matter of fact, Frank's one of the people that was a source for Ida Tarbell. She met with him and asked him questions about John and his personality. And Frank always resented the fact that John had made this much money and was in charge. And, Frank wanted to be in charge. So I think his resentment kind of drove him to talk to Ida Tarbell and, say a lot of the nasty things that were said. As he got older, starting in kind of the early 1900s, and particularly after the company was broken up, the monopolies were broken up, he had been giving to charity, but he had been doing it very haphazardly, sort of randomly. He decided he needed a more systematic way to give to charity. And at the time, these big foundations didn't really exist. You didn't have these mammoth charities like United Way, or some of these ones that are overarching of multiple charitable organizations. So he actually met a man named Frederick T. Gates. Now, Gates was a Baptist preacher, or had been a Baptist preacher, and Gates advised him on ways to give his money away more effectively. Now, at first, John D. Rockefeller really just wanted to give money away to Baptist causes. He was very much about that. And Frederick T. Gates helped him realize that he could do that, but he could also give away money interdenominationally, and that he also should find a niche that he could give away money to that wouldn't be as controversial. And this is especially important because he was trying to mend this bad reputation he had. He pretended not to care about what Ida Tarbell said, but really it did impact him, and it impacted his family because they all heard these awful things but were at odds about what they thought of their father versus what was said about him, right?
So this Ida Tarbell was just a constant thorn in his side, and like the kind of the voice of the other side all the time.
So it was interesting because even though Teddy Roosevelt prosecuted or pushed the trust busters, he also was kind of anti muckraking. He called Ida Tarbell a classic muckraker. It's funny because later in life, they met briefly. John D. Sr. met Ida Tarbell briefly, and she kind of softened on him a little bit. And it was also when he had given so much of his money away, she sort of said, you're not the bad guy I thought you were. But interestingly, the person who was really impacted by John D. Rockefeller's bad press was his son, Rockefeller Jr., John D. Rockefeller Jr. Now, Jr. was a very nervous child, didn't have a lot of self-confidence, and was very much a pleaser like his father had been, very much a bookkeeper, and, kept his books in order as John D. had when he was a child. he brought his son in to help him start with the charitable foundations and to start giving money away. And along with Frederick T. Gates, they realized that the thing they could give away the most money to that was not going to have any sort of or very little controversy was health, was public health, right? So that was a focus of them for the first few years of their philanthropy, was figuring out ways to help people be more healthy. So, of course, the South had just gone through the Civil War. It had been a few years since the Civil War, but it really tore the South apart. One of the things that they started focusing on was hookworm. It was something that a lot of Southerners got because they walked around barefoot. And it was something that would attach itself to your feet and then get in your skin and cause all kinds of problems. And it was very, very easy to alleviate, to cure, and to avoid. But most Southerners just didn't know how to do it. So that was one of the first things they did, was started a foundation giving. I think it started with like $1 million. It was interesting, though, because even that got politicized. COVID's been a little bit politicized, or at least it was a few years ago. Hookworm was politicized because the Southerners didn't want this Northern Yankee coming in and calling them a bunch of dumb country bumpkins, like we can handle our own damn feet kind of thing. So he and Gates kind of figured out a way to change the name of it. They did a little bit of branding work on it to make sure that they could help people with hookworm and how to avoid it. That was one of their big things. They just called it the General Education Board. It was originally called like the Rockefeller Foundation to remove and destroy hookworm in the South or something like that. But they realized that that was going to be offensive to Southerners. So they called it the General Education Board. And it was basically educating people about hygiene and how to stay healthy.
I thought you meant they changed the name of hookworm to something more palatable.
No, they changed the name of their organization to sound less preachy.
They should have changed the name of hookworm.
I don't know. Hookworm's pretty. If I was going to be a worm, I think hookworm is. I mean, I can't think of.
It's definitely descriptive for the worm.
Well, ultimately, this guy Gates really helped him understand that there were better ways of giving, and their collaboration came to fruition in 1913, where they founded the Rockefeller Foundation. And this became a very, very big giving organization. Now, a foundation actually has to be approved by Congress. This had to go through Congress. And of course, there was still a lot of bad press about John D and a lot of bad press about Standard Oil. John D had actually stepped away from Standard Oil before the antitrust thing happened. He had realized it was affecting his health because he had some health issues earlier. He realized it was affecting his relationship with his family, and he had gotten to be where he was still the president of the company, but somebody else was running it. So a lot of the things also that were said about him and his, about Standard Oil weren't under his watch. But the thing is, he knew these things were happening and he let them happen. And he would often just feign, Alex is running Dirt Nap City. I don't know what he said. I can't control that guy, And so there was some culpability there. As a matter of fact, there was a thing that happened called the Ludlow Massacre. Have you ever heard of the Ludlow Massacre?
No.
So in 1913, there was a strike at a coal and steel mine in Colorado, and basically the unions and the workers got into a pretty nasty arms race. They both were bringing in guns, bringing in strike busters, scabs, bringing in thugs to keep the order. And these tents got set up around the mines by the miners who were striking because they didn't want the scabs to come in or the strike breakers to come in. And they kind of escalated. And during this time, John D Rockefeller and his son, Rockefeller Jr., were both being told what was going on, but they were being told a sanitized version of it. And they were being told, yeah, it's all under control. Don't worry about it. They were very anti-union. They didn't like the idea of unions. Of course, they owned a big business, right? That kind of makes sense that they wouldn't like unions. So they sat back, and what ended up happening is the National Guards and some of these guys who had been deputized on the spot came in and opened fire with weapons and lit fire to the tents that these strikers were staying in, and ended up killing like 15 women and children who had been hiding in these tents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was kind of a turning moment for John D. Rockefeller Jr. Now, his father never really accepted responsibility for that. His father kind of said, "Well, I wasn't there. I didn't order them to do that." But he let it happen. But for John D. Rockefeller Jr., he kind of realized that he should have been more responsible. I mean, he was one of the owners of this company, and had a say in how this was going to go down. And he ended up going to Colorado, visiting the site, meeting with the strikers, meeting with the unions, trying to improve things, seeing the conditions that they lived in, and actually going down into the mine. And that was really a huge thing for him because he had never had a lot of confidence before that. And it was a point where his father said that he really handled it well, even though his father wouldn't accept responsibility, by the fact that his son said, "You know what, we could have done better by these people who are working in our mines at the at the Colorado Fuel and Iron." It was called CF&I. He actually kind of said mea culpa, and a lot of people respected that.
It's probably very easy to forget what the average person goes through when you're up where the Rockefellers are. It's probably very easy to forget about the common man.
Well, what's interesting about what you just said is that Junior never lived like the common man. Junior was born into great wealth, right? And so he never even knew, and yet he's the one that ended up taking a more conciliatory and apologetic tone and going in and talking to them, meeting with them, taking the trip to Colorado, which he didn't have to do. His father, who had been born poor and grown up in a, more in that situation, his father wouldn't admit to any wrongdoing.
You know who's responsible a lot of times for that is the nanny or the housekeeper or the help. Sometimes they can get in your ear and let you know what's going on out there. Of course, Senior didn't have that because his nanny was also his father's mistress, right?
Right. Well, no, the mistress lived with the other family that he didn't live with. So
Right.
he had a messed up situation, and he had to become a man at a very young age and take care of his family when he was very young. It was also very much a different time, the early 1900s. If you think about like the Roaring '20s that we came into, the Titanic and the moving pictures and airplanes and automobiles and all the things that started happening during that time were such a big departure from where Senior had lived, where John D. Rockefeller Sr. had lived in the, mid to late 1800s. But
for sure, it's probably like similar to like the 1990s. Where change was just happening super fast.
Yeah. So ultimately, this was kind of a big step for John Jr., who actually kind of realized if he was going to be a leader, he had to take more responsibility. But he really found his passion in the philanthropic side of what the Rockefellers did. At this point, John D. Rockefeller's wealth was so great that because remember, he had gone from owning a majority stake in one company to owning a majority stake in 34 companies when they split it up. And these companies, guess what? When Standard Oil of Cleveland and Standard Oil of Ohio and Standard Oil of California and Standard Oil of, all these ones that became Exxon and Chevron, et cetera, when they were all made, it was right around the time the automobile came out. So cars were just getting popular, and they learned how to refine gasoline. And so it just skyrocketed. And, they still basically had single ownership, or a concentrated ownership among all these companies. Now, eventually these companies did become rivals. They started to compete with each other, but it took a long time for that to happen. And interestingly, during World War I, it was actually requested by the government that these companies work together closely to increase output, like more like a monopoly. They kind of they broke up the monopoly, and then they said during World War One, wait a minute, we need as much fuel as you guys can provide, and as much oil and as much efficiency. So even though you're different companies now, behave like a monopoly. So all of this worked in John D's favor, and he became a shareholder in so many companies that were making so much money with so many dividends that he actually was not able to give the money away fast enough. Like he almost couldn't spend. He was getting buried by the amount of money that was being made at this time. And remember, $900 million was the top of his wealth in 1920. No, sorry, in 1913. That is that was at the time 3% of US GDP. 39 billion was GDP in 1913. And so one billion of that almost was belonged to John D Rockefeller, and the money would be worth like 26 billion or 27 billion today. So crazy amount of money. And nobody had that kind of money. There weren't Jeff Bezos, and there weren't these crazy billionaires
No,
that we
it's
have.
just him and Vanderbilt had all the money.
Yeah. So and Carnegie. Although he was richer than both those guys. He ended up exceeding Vanderbilt. So all of that said, his son kind of took over his philanthropic era. He gave to a university that was specifically for Black women. And that was something that was very, very uncommon back there for Black women to go to college. And he ended up giving to that university and helping actually get it off the ground and to build an endowment for it. He gave to what later became Chicago University, was originally the first Baptist university that he gave to. So he was very big on education. He was very big on education among Black people, former slaves. And there was actually a lot of debate back then between people as to whether it was better to educate former slaves in the same way that whites were educated, or to teach them trades, to teach them to be, I don't know, manage horses or take care of trades, more of a blue collar kind of work. And Rockefeller was very much on the side of educating Black people the same way that he educated white people. He felt like they should. It's not to say that he didn't have some racism in him or something like that, but it is to say that when it came to actually the way that people were going to get by, he felt like education should be equal among anybody. It didn't matter your gender, your age, or your race. So that was pretty admirable. So Rockefeller did, in the 1920s, start to suffer some digestive problems, a little bit of depression. He had alopecia. Do you know what that is?
That's where you lose your hair.
Yes. So he started losing his hair in actually the early 1900s, and lost his mustache, and ended up being a big wearer of toupees. You were mentioning toupees earlier. He had quite a few toupees. When his wife finally died, his wife is named Laura, but they all called her Seti. She was a very, very pious and temperate woman. She very much didn't like to flaunt their wealth. She very much didn't like to overdress or to put on any sort of airs. As a matter of fact, it was said that when Seti died, her wardrobe was very underwhelming, was what the paper said about it, because she never bought anything fancy, And when she died, John D actually started to become a little bit more risque. For example, they never went to plays or movies. It kind of went against their religious beliefs. They never played cards. They never drank or gambled. And he never did drink or gamble. That was something he just wouldn't do. As a matter of fact, they gave money originally to the temperance movement, for the 18th Amendment, which eventually they supported repealing the 18th Amendment because they saw it wasn't working. But he didn't drink, But he did end up playing cards. He did end up playing the stock market, which his son considered gambling. He did end up starting to buy more clothes and to take an interest in cars. Like he loved cars because he'd made his money on oil, so why shouldn't he? And he was kind of famous when he got older. He ended up spending a lot of time in Florida. He would go out in the community, and he would hand out dimes to adults who did him a favor, or if he just met somebody and wanted to make an impression, he would give them a dime, and nickels to children. And he kind of saw it as that was sort of his signature.
I mean, it sounds generous, I suppose, for a guy worth billions. It's cool. He's the moneybags guy, right?
He is the moneybags guy, and maybe a little bit of Monty Burns in there,
Yeah.
if from The Simpsons.
I can't picture him. Did he look kind of like Mr. Monopoly, or did he look like a rich, like, did he wear a monocle and a top hat and all that? Where does that trope come from?
So he did wear a top hat, and he did not wear a monocle, but because of his alopecia, he did have sort of this gaunt look. Like, he did kind of look like a corpse, especially later in life. A lot of people said he took up golf, and he ended up playing a lot of golf. And this, again, is all after his wife died, because when she was alive, he sort of didn't have a lot of fun. Like, he kind of learned how to have fun. As a matter of fact, in the book, they talked about him aging backwards. He became a little bit of a flirt when he was older, and even some women reported him as being kind of grabby as he was older, which wouldn't fly today. But he was the richest man in the world, and I
think most older rich people are grabby today.
Yeah, today still.
Yeah.
There's actually one word that was used again and again in the book that I thought was really interesting. It's the word farthing. Do you know what that means?
No, it sounds like an old-timey word.
So a farthing is a monetary unit in the UK. Like,
oh, right. Yeah, farthing. Yeah, I think Dickens writes about a farthing.
So it's the smallest amount. It's like a quarter of a penny, like 1/4 of 1 penny. And
okay.
so if he would, Rockefeller would often say, I don't give a farthing about that woman, or I don't give a farthing about what they think. And meant, I could not care less. Like, 1 farthing is the smallest amount you can care. I don't care at all. But yeah, his son ended up inheriting much of his wealth. He did not give as much to his daughters. Number one, because of the times. It was just, you gave it to your son, you didn't give it to your daughters. But number two, his son was very much the one who had always been by him and pleased him, and was a lot like him in terms of his piety and his religious beliefs and his conservatism and his bookkeeping even. His daughters were certainly a little more liberal, a little more with the women's lib movement and the flappers of the 1920s. He had one daughter that lived in Europe and really wouldn't come see him, and she was very much involved with sort of spiritualists and psychologists. Jung, I think the guy, you heard of Jung? Carl Jung. Yeah, she was involved with him, and anyway. He still left him like $22 million, the daughters, but he gave his son like $500 million or something. So his son ended up investing pretty well. They did get hit pretty hard during the Depression. In the late 1800s, there was a depression, and then again in the 1930s, of course. But his son made it back up, and now Rockefeller is synonymous with so many things, so many medical schools, so many colleges, so many historically black women's college, with Rockefeller Center. I think 30 Rock is named after that. And a lot of that was his son later in life. His son's main job was to give away his father's money to these charitable organizations. And, it's easy for us to think, well, if I had all that money, I could give it away. I wouldn't have any problem. The thing was that John D Rockefeller and his son were both very, very intentional and thoughtful about who they gave their money to. They got lots of requests. You can imagine the letters. They said that thousands of letters would come into him weekly.
This is the life of Bill Gates and Melinda Gates today,
Yeah.
trying to give away all that money separately now. But yeah, they say it's not easy because you get so many requests, and you just want to find the biggest bang for the buck too. You
Yes.
know,
Yep.
philanthropy is an interesting topic.
That was exactly what he wanted to do. And really, this guy, Frederick Gates, really helped him pioneer early large scale philanthropy. Gates and his son were two guys that really helped him kind of figure out a system to do that. He eventually didn't even read letters that came in. Gates took care of that. All he did was, once they were going to make a major donation or make some sort of a you know open a foundation or start something, all that John D Rockefeller Sr. requested was veto power. He wanted to hear the case for it, and in most cases he approved it, and in some cases he vetoed it because he didn't think it was worthwhile or well thought out. So yeah, very much a titan of industry, captain of industry for the time.
Like the Titan, the OG.
The OG, yep. Richest man in the world. And again, as you said, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. He was the vice president under Gerald Ford. He did try to run as a Republican, but interestingly, he never got the nomination because he was a liberal Republican. And, the last time he tried was against Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was, kind of more for the conservatives, appealed more to conservatives. And so Nelson Rockefeller ended up never getting the nomination for president.
What notable Rockefellers are there today?
That's a great question. I mean, there is a couple of things. I did read that book Titan, as I mentioned earlier. There's also on the History Channel a series about the Titans of industry, and it interviews a lot of Rockefeller's descendants. I couldn't tell you their names. There is a John D Rockefeller III that I believe is still alive,
Really?
And was the son of John D Rockefeller's son, John D Rockefeller. And then, of course, having had two brothers and a sister, and his other brother Frank, who didn't like him, had children. His brother Will had children. So there's a lot of them around, but I couldn't tell you any of them today. I don't know their names.
I remember when I was a kid, there was a Michael Rockefeller that disappeared. Do you remember this?
No.
Like in Papua New Guinea, and they said he was eaten by cannibals, which, I was like 6 years old, and that was the first time I'd ever heard about cannibals.
All right. I'm looking it up right now. It says Rockefeller was never seen despite an intensive search, and at the time of disappearance was a major news item. His body was never found, and he was determined legally dead. I guess they went in a dugout canoe. And
did I make up the cannibals part?
It says it was originally reported that Rockefeller either drowned or was attacked by a shark or a saltwater crocodile. However, because headhunting and cannibalism were still present in some areas of Asmat in 1961, there's also been speculation that Rockefeller may have been killed and eaten by tribespeople from the Asmat village.
So I don't know. Take your pick. Shark, alligator, headhunters.
Saltwater alligator. Saltwater crocodile. Yeah. I think I'd probably go with the shark, because I feel like I would just pull you under and be done with it.
With the headhunters, at least you feel like maybe you could talk your way out of it.
Yeah, no, very true. Very, very interesting. I did kind of go down a bit of a rabbit hole with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Andrew Carnegie, but ultimately these guys, it's interesting that they all knew each other and met each other. Some other famous people that Rockefeller met was, of course, Henry Ford. As a matter of fact, the last time he saw Henry Ford was when he was 96 years old, 97 years old. And by the way, Rockefeller always hoped to live to 100, and he died like 2 weeks before his 98th birthday. So he lived a long life, especially for someone of that time period.
Yeah.
But he died at 97. He saw Henry Ford the year before, and when Ford was leaving, he said, "I'll see you in heaven, Mr. Ford." And Ford said, "If they let you in, John."
That's a burn.
He also his son was also pretty pally with Mark Twain. So Mark Twain was also a guy who had a lot of influence at the time, and they sort of used him a little bit to bolster their image, because of his folksiness, Twain's folksiness. As a matter of
Sure.
fact, they had him introduce them at a few different events, and it was said that Mark Twain really liked John D Rockefeller because he thought he was a scoundrel. It's kind of like the people who vote for Trump because Trump shakes things up.
Mhm.
Mark Twain said the same thing about Rockefeller. He's like, I don't know that this guy's always doing the right thing, but he owns it, and I like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for telling me about Rockefeller. That was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully next time you're center court at Rockefeller Center, or watching 30 Rock, or getting a shot for hookworm, you'll think of Mr. John D. Rockefeller Sr. And I will go look at. I think it would be good to go look and see what his children are up to today. Hopefully that wealth is still causing good, but
Probably
ultimately,
is.
despite him being very vilified and probably doing a lot of things he shouldn't have in business, he really did have a sincere heart when it came to giving his money away and doing good in the world.
Not unlike Henry VIII.
Not unlike Henry VIII, although he never openly chopped their heads off. So, all right, my man. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you like this type of thing, please be sure to subscribe to Dirt Nap City. If you have suggestions for episodes, hit us at Dirt Nap City. That's NOT at Dirt Nap City, and we'll be sure to get back to you.
Especially if you lead a double life.